Hear my cry for truth, my cry for truth, my cry for you.
Greetings and welcome to the Hey Pastor podcast. I am your host, Pastor Mark Lambert from Liberty Hill Baptist Church in Moody, Texas. You can find out more about the church at lhbcmoody.org. You can find this podcast, past episodes, or submit a question for future episodes at heypastor.org. This time around, I'm not so much as responding to a question as anticipating what questions might be out there. Taking this opportunity to speak with Clinton Wilcox from the Life Training Institute in California on the issue of bioethics. If you're not familiar with that term, it has to do with biology and medicine and how it interacts with our ethics and morality. As medical science and biology increases our knowledge of life and the human body, it intersects at an ever-increasing rate with our sense of morality and the basis of what we believe about life and the way it should be treated and considered as sacred. And so we, as followers of Christ, as people seeking to live out the Bible, should be aware of these issues and how we ought to approach them, not just for our own life, but in a culture which often disagrees with us. And so, without further rambling on my part, let's get on to the conversation that I had with Clinton. Thank you for agreeing to this. To be completely upfront on the issue of bioethics, I am, I don't know much of anything. I'm just as intrigued and ignorant as the next person. And so
okay. Yeah. And again, to be clear, I really wasn't trying to guilt trip you to have me on your podcast.
No. That's fine. It actually is a very interesting and timely issue that I think a lot of people don't even think about.
Yeah.
And so, again, the purpose of this podcast is usually to answer questions that have been submitted, but occasionally I anticipate questions that are probably out there but aren't being asked.
Yeah.
And given some of the recent current events and issues that have been hot button topics, I think that this is something that's on people's minds, but not something they really know much about on how to approach and think about. And so, thought whenever you made the offer, all jokes aside, I thought, well, actually, that would be a good thing. And so, kind of just what I wanted to do, unless you think that's completely the wrong way to do it, is just kind of look at what is bioethics, why is this even important? Right? Why is this something that we should care about? And, that this podcast is more than just a cure for insomnia. And how should we as followers of Christ approach maybe those issues? And maybe in the next, half hour, we can solve everybody's problems and give everybody all the tools they need to be experts on the subject.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go. There you go. There's your challenge, and go.
All right.
So,
yeah, thanks.
Let's just start. Well, first off, before we jump into all that, who is Clinton? Why should anyone care what you have to say on the matter? Who is this person I'm bringing on my podcast? And just tell us a little bit about you and your ministry.
Okay, sure. Well, my name is Clinton Wilcox, and I'm a staff apologist with Life Training Institute. If anyone is out there familiar with the pro-life issue, Life Training Institute is the organization which has Scott Klusendorf as its president. And Scott Klusendorf is probably or at least one of the leading pro-life speakers and thinkers today. There are other big names like Greg Cunningham and others who've been around for a very long time. And so if Scott isn't the best, he's one of the best pro-life thinkers and speakers that we have around today, and debaters as well. So I basically work for Scott. I I live in California, and basically I got into the pro-life movement when I was starting out going to college. I took a public speaking class and had to do a presentation on a controversial topic, and the one I chose was abortion. And through a series of events, I decided that this was something I had to speak out about, and so I started getting mentored by Josh Brahm, another big name in the movement, and I became a speaker and mentor for Justice for All, which has Stephen Wagner as its president. And so through all of these, I basically became a pro-life writer and speaker myself. And so my niche in the pro-life movement is education. I basically specialize in training pro-life people how to make the pro-life case effectively and persuasively. So, that's kind of what I do in the movement. That's a little brief snippet of my history in the pro-life movement as well.
Okay, awesome. I've kind of shied away from the abortion issue, large part because I don't know if I'm capable of engaging in it respectfully. I tend to get filled with rage, and so
Right.
I try to not engage in that. I'll Sanctity of Life Sundays. I'll preach a message. I'll address some things, but I tend to not get into it with people. I don't know that I
Right.
can maintain a Christ-like manner. Hopefully you can maybe give us some good ways to think about and approach that, maybe
Yeah,
temper
definitely.
that. Now, you actually, whenever you brought up the possible topic, you didn't mention abortion. You just said bioethics generally. What is it? I guess how would you define bioethics? Abortion would be a niche under that umbrella, but for people who aren't familiar with the term, I guess, how would you define
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, so abortion is a species under the genus of bioethics. And so bioethics generally is basically just ethics relating to the margins of life. So beginning of life issues like abortion, infanticides, embryonic stem cell research, things like that all fall under bioethics, as well as things at the end of life, such as euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, how we treat the terminally ill, things like that, as well as other things relating to the margins of life, such as transhumanism, the idea that we can upload our consciousness into a robot body or somehow transcend the barriers of humanity. Things like animal rights also fall under bioethics. So it's a pretty wide umbrella. And so, well, I'm happy to talk about abortion, and that's really, I tend to specialize more in abortion than I do the other areas of bioethics, but the basic pro-life syllogism that it is wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being, that first premise of the syllogism, if that premise is true, then it has implications for all the bioethical issues, or at least most of the bioethical issues, not just abortion. And so it's good to talk about it generally, especially since a lot of the other issues are starting to become more prevalent in our culture today. We've had now, I think, 3 states in the United States who have legalized physician-assisted suicide, and so these issues are not just they're not really just intellectual problems, but they have actual real-world implications. And knowing the issues is not just good as far as being able to debate with people and being able to justify your own position, but it's also stuff that we have to know because they're issues that we deal with as well. If a Christian, for example, finds himself with a girl who's unintended pregnant, who's got pregnant without intending to, whether it be a girlfriend or a wife, or the woman herself deals with an unplanned pregnancy. If they don't know why we're pro-life, then they might end up making the wrong decision about abortion. Or when it comes to end-of-life issues, if they don't know what the arguments are against euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, they might actually make the wrong decision when they have to make that end-of-life decision for a loved one or even for themselves. So these are issues that are not just intellectual problems, and they're not just good to know so that we can debate people and justify our worldview, but they're things to know because they can impact us personally as well.
Good stuff. I know that me personally, the church I'm at, and what seems to be the trend in a lot of areas of Christendom is that you have aging church populations, right? So you'll have a congregation that is heavily tilted towards the senior citizen side. And so whereas someone sitting here at 40, myself, this can be all academic for me, but I have a congregation that, there's probably some end of life stuff that they're starting to think about and wrestle with.
Right.
And so, and the abortion issue gets all of the press so often. It's kind of the hot topic. However, there's all sorts of things that I see going on. Like you were saying, this isn't just some academic thing for the eggheads to argue about and think lofty thoughts. I mean, this gets down to the day-to-day life things. And so and I don't know if it's just too broad of a topic. Maybe you touched on it with that one premise from the pro-life argument. But what's just kind of the general, framework that you would say, step one, that we should be approaching these issues from?
Yeah, that is kind of a broad question, and I think most of it really boils down to your ultimate worldview. That whatever worldview you hold is going to ultimately decide how you approach these issues. I myself am a Christian, and so ultimately my view is that life has ultimate sanctity, and since our rights are grounded in God, they're inalienable, as our own forefathers have written down in the Declaration of Independence. That means that not only would it be wrong to take that right from me, such as the government oppressing my rights, but it's also wrong for me to give those rights away. So I can't just kill myself whenever I become emotionally distraught, or if I have a terminal diagnosis for an illness, those kinds of things. So my Christian views of the sanctity of life really underscore my views of bioethics, but also I think that there are good non-religious arguments we can make as well. And so, mostly if you're a Christian, you're probably going to oppose most of these things like abortion, euthanasia, things like that. And if you're an atheist, you're more likely to grant them because we have different ideas about what rights are and how they're grounded. But that's not a universal claim, because I have friends who are atheists who are also pro-life, and so they would ground their pro-life convictions differently than I do. So I would say that ultimately it's the worldview which is probably a big indicator for how you're going to come down on it. But there are other non-religious arguments we can make, as since our culture is becoming a lot more pluralistic, and non-Christian ideas are getting a fair hearing in the public square. So now Christians have to we can't just rely on the Christian arguments, but we have to start making non-religious arguments as well. And so that's part of the education that I do in the pro-life movement, is I show that, we don't just have to rely on the Bible or on appealing to God to make our case, but there are good non-religious arguments. And we should be making non-religious arguments because, as has been said, I think by St. Augustine, that all truth is God's truth. And so when we make a non-religious case for the pro-life position to a non-religious person, we're still making a Christian case. We're just making it without appeal to authorities that they don't recognize as legitimate.
And I think that is definitely important. That's one thing that has bothered me. One thing that just stuck with me. One day in college, I'm walking up to meet a friend. He's sitting out at some picnic tables talking to a girl. And I come walking up, and they're in a obviously heated conversation. So I just sit nearby to just kind of wait for them to finish. And I pick up the conversation, and he's trying to evangelize. And he's talking to her about needing Jesus and sin and everything. And he keeps quoting the Bible. He has his Bible open. He keeps flipping over and going, well, over here it says this, and over here it says this. And at one point she reaches over, slams his Bible shut, and goes, I don't care what your stupid book says. Right? And that kind of has stuck with me through the years. And I have conversations with people who are unbelievers, and whenever you come to these issues in the cultural, in the public square, it really kind of comes down to them basically saying, I don't care what your stupid book says. And so we need to be able to represent the truth of God without just quoting scripture at them.
Right. Yeah, because I think it was Norm Geisler who I first read that basically stated that, apologetics doesn't save anybody, but it's what we would, or it might have been Lee Strobel, but basically it's the idea that apologetics isn't for salvation. Apologetics is what they call pre-evangelism, that it basically removes roadblocks to somebody believing. And so, so you definitely need to be aware of those. And the same thing goes with the abortion and bioethics issues too, is that we've actually seen people come to Christ after that person knows that that Christians have reasonable arguments for their views on abortion and other issues. So even bioethics can be a form of pre-evangelism, just like the Kalam cosmological argument or the fine-tuning argument can be.
And one thing that's really interesting, I'm probably engaged on social media more than I really should be, but there's a group that I've been involved in for a few years that is strictly a atheist Christian debate over religion, existence of God. Well, some of the folks from that group created a new group that is just broad, any topic kind of a thing. And so I got invited, so I joined that group, and I noticed conversations where atheists over in the strictly religious conversation group that just drive me crazy. That I just, they just drive me right up the wall. But then over here,
right,
where we're in a group where we're talking about all kinds of other things, it's like, wait a minute, we agree on that. Oh, here's this political issue. We agree on that. Here's this. We agree on that. And so we start seeing that, hey, you know what? There's actually is this common ground once we get out of just the our kind of tribal argue based on that one topic. And so, what was I saying? Where was I going with that? On this issue that there is common ground. One of my favorite pro-life groups on Facebook that I like to share their stuff is a secular pro-life group. That they're not making religious arguments. They're making the scientific arguments and and different things. And so, like I said, all truth is God's truth, and I think that we as Christians we need to know the theological reasons. Absolutely,
right.
But we also need to understand. Hey, you know what? Reality is what it is, and here's how we can explain it apart from theology, also.
Yeah. So that secular pro-life group, that's secular pro-life that you're talking about, right?
I think so. I think that's just the name, secular pro-life.
Okay, yeah, because Kelsey Hazard is a friend of mine, and she's the one who runs that organization. And yeah, you can actually find some of my articles on their blog as well. And so they allow a wide range of people to publish, just make sure that the arguments are non-religious. And so people from different walks of life have published on that blog. And so I'm definitely a really big supporter of theirs.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Coming into this conversation, I didn't really have a lot of particular idea of where it should go or what I wanted to ask.
Of course.
And so, because like I said, I'm really largely ignorant on the issue writ large. There's a few, abortion things that I'm a little more familiar with. But generally the position, I think, just coming from a pro-life, across the board pro-life, not just abortion, but just pro-life, is that life is sacred, as you said, that it's something that needs to be defended. It's wrong to intentionally end a life, unjustified.
Right.
And so as we enter into all these other issues, I think what can muddy the water is that there's so much overlap from other areas of life. The recent controversy over what was his name, Alfie?
Alfie Evans, I think.
I probably had more discussions or arguments over that on a political basis than I did a pro-life basis. And so that just kind of shows that whenever it comes to these issues, that there are other areas of life and ideology that blend over these. How do we, I don't know, I guess try to navigate those waters? Do you have any?
The cases of there have been a couple of cases that got popular here in the United States of kids who were terminally ill and they were dying, and the English hospital and government wouldn't allow the parents to take the kid to a different country to see if the doctors there can help them. I'm not too knowledgeable on all of the ins and outs of those cases, so I try not to talk about them too much. So I just kind of make some general claims in that I don't I don't think that it's necessarily the government's not just right, but the government's place to decide for parents what they're going to do with their child. And so, just the fact that they're trying to take the place of the parents, even if they think they know better than the parents, it still really bothers me that they're the ones who are trying to usurp that authority from the parents. And so that kind of thing is really bothersome to me. There was one case of I'm trying to I don't know them too well. I mean, there's Alfie Evans, and then there was Charlie Gard. One of them was a worse case than the others. Like, even the doctor who could have operated on one said, "Look, it's too late. We really can't do anything about it." So bringing him here to the United States won't really help. And then the other one, I think Alfie was the one they wanted to take to Italy, seemed to have a better chance that the doctors might have been able to find out what was wrong. And so, whether or not the parents were acting in the child's best interest, or whether the parents were right and wrong, it's not really the doctors or the government's place to make that determination for the parents. And so that was really the thing that bothered me most about these cases. And so, I'm glad here in the United States we have a lot more freedom than they do there in England. That's really all I can say about those. But this just kind of really also illustrates why we need to know about these cases, about whether it's right or wrong to to intentionally kill people, even in terminal cases, because we could be making a grave mistake if we perform a particular action. And this is, these are life or death situations. And if we act wrongly, we could be killing someone unjustly, or we could be making them suffer unjustly. And so that's why it really behooves us to make sure we're reading the literature on these issues, and make sure we really understand what's going on.
I know that I heard one case, and it was one of those kind of things where my Facebook refreshed and I lost the link, so I went hunting for it. But in hunting for it, I found 50 other examples of cases where someone was right on the verge. Doctors were saying there's no hope, they're brain dead, whatever, just need to pull the plug, just end the life, it's a mercy thing. And then they wake up and make a recovery. And so it's just, I think, like you're saying, we need, there's certain things we need to know. This isn't the kind of thing that we need to just be feeling our way through blindly, especially in the midst of the situation when emotions are high.
Right.
That we need to have some things pre-thought out that we understand, so that we're grounded in some principles.
Yeah.
That drive us through those situations.
Right. And when I see people interacting on these, especially people who haven't really done any reading or study on the issues, you can really tell that there's an extreme lack of nuanced thinking among these people. And it's on both sides of the issue. I'm not trying to single out one side or the other, but it's especially distressing from people on my side, because I want people on my side to make the good arguments and be clear thinkers, and then I see them making these really bad arguments, and then that is really, it just kind of grieves me a bit, because I know that we have really good arguments, and we need to be making them, but especially when it comes to something like euthanasia, because the fact that we would argue that it's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being doesn't translate then into an obligation to always keep human beings alive. So, if a doctor administers a drug that's going to end the life of that human being, well, that's clearly a case of euthanasia. And, pro-life people would argue that that's a case of unjustified homicide, or if it was illegal, it would be murder. Murder, of course, being a legal term, but we would say that it's an unjustified form of homicide. But if a person is in the last stage of life and is just being kept alive by a ventilator, by life support, and the doctor removes that life support, well, that's not a case of unjustified homicide. The doctor is not responsible for the person dying. The person's underlying pathology is responsible for his death. So taking a person off of life support is not killing the person. It's just letting nature take its course. And so we have to understand the difference between actually killing somebody, performing an act that literally results in the person's death, or just allowing nature to take its course, which is the person dies of his own pathology or of natural causes. That's not the doctor killing the patient. And so there are various nuances among these issues too that really hurts our credibility if we fail to make them.
Yeah, and I think those distinctions are probably a little easier towards the end of life, especially when you probably have the person's input If they've already established,
Yeah.
signed a do not resuscitate order, or they've made their wishes known, or maybe it's in their will or
Mm.
whatever, where they've already said, hey, look, just let me go. Right? That kind of,
Mm.
a lot of
Right.
that makes it easier. Where as at the beginning of life, you're dealing with someone who can't talk, you don't know what they're feeling, you don't know what they're thinking, they can't express themselves, and so they get little murkier waters to navigate, I think, in some cases. But
Right.
I have no idea where I was going with that.
It's all right.
In just a little bit of time we have left, that there are, well, what would you say, or say maybe the top three culturally relevant bioethical issues for Christians nowadays?
Okay. The top three culturally relevant, I would say, number one, definitely abortion. Number two would be euthanasia / physician-assisted suicide. They both kind of go together. And then the third one, for the third one, I'd probably say animal rights, because we're really seeing now a push by organizations like PETA to try and get animals recognized as persons. And we also have various philosophers like Peter Singer and Michael Tooley who are arguing that infanticide of human beings is permissible and we should be allowing it. And by the same token, there are certain types of animals which we should be treating as persons, such as apes and dolphins. So I think animal rights is probably the one I would list as third, even though there are, well, actually animal rights, I'd say maybe animal rights and embryonic stem cell research are probably tied for third, or embryonic stem cell research might just edge out animal rights as the third place. But those are definitely some of the biggest that we have.
Okay, and there has been a tremendous amount of ink spilt and words spoken on the abortion issue, but on the other two, what is something like on the euthanasia, assisted suicide, kind of as followers of Christ? Because primarily, first and foremost, I'm a pastor, you're an apologist, it's kind of the issue that we are coming from is we as disciples, as followers of Christ, how should we approach and enter in those issues? Just real quick.
Yeah. So how should we approach them as followers of Christ?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, prayer is a big part of it. In fact, one of my friends in the who's really done a lot of work in euthanasia has been asking us to fast and pray for Ireland, because right now Ireland is taking a vote to repeal the Eighth Amendment, and the Eighth Amendment is the amendment which grants personhood rights to the unborn. And so right now, pro-abortion groups and people are trying to take rights away from the unborn so that women can go and have abortions. So as Christians, fasting and prayer are definitely two of the biggest components to it. Another major thing that we can do is just to be educated on the issue. Whenever Scott talks about abortion, he basically says that the days of being less educated than our opponents is over. We have to be better read. We have to make better arguments than our opposition. And so another thing that we need to do is we need to know the issues, because these are very, very important issues. We have euthanasia in which we're talking about whether or not we can kill innocent people, even for what seem to be good reasons. Someone is terminally ill and has no prospects of life and doesn't want to degenerate and lose their mental faculties. Can we kill a person in that situation? Well, we need to be well read in order to know that. And when it comes to the abortion issue, we have literally approximately 300 unborn children being led to the slaughter every day in the United States. And so Scripture tells us that we need to speak up for those without a voice, and we need to stand up for the oppressed. Well, we have oppressed in our country right now, which is the unborn. And so we need to be speaking out and making a case for their humanity and the fact that they have rights as well. And so all of these things really have biblical implications as well. So just to recap, I would say, prayer and fasting, definitely be educated on the issues and be willing to speak out about them, even if your calling is not to be an apologist or not to be a philosopher or something like that. Just talking about the issue in your sphere of influence with friends and family will go a long way as well, because you never know what life you might be saving on down the road. They might think back to something that you said 10 years ago that really stuck with them that they hadn't really thought about. And so as Greg Koukl says in his book Tactics, what we really just want to do is put a pebble in the person's shoe, give them something that they can't stop thinking about, like a pebble in their shoe, because we're rarely ever going to change anybody's mind on the spot. It takes a long time, not just from ourselves, but someone else down the road might be the one who actually brings the person over and converts them based on all of the work that we've been doing to try and change them as well.
Awesome. One thing that you mentioned, Greg Koukl, and one thing that's kind of stuck in my mind that I remember him saying about the euthanasia issue. I remember whenever I was a teenager, someone asked me what I thought about euthanasia, and I thought, I don't know any youth from Asia.
Right.
Now, as far as the assisted suicide, he mentioned a slippery slope, and there's legitimate slippery slopes and there's fallacies, but he mentioned that kind of the trend that you will see is, you'll go from it's okay if you want to, go ahead and end your life, to it's a right to end your life, to almost an obligation to end your life, whether you want to or not. And so that's one of the things that the assisted suicide, because some people will say things like, well, what's the big deal? I mean, it's their life. They're in pain. They just want to end it. Shouldn't they have that freedom? But and you might know this better than me because I'm just repeating what I heard someone else say, that the trend in places who have gone that route, it actually starts to drift into you have an obligation to end your life. If you're sick and infirm and you're old and taking up resources and, in pain, well, then, you need to just check out.
Yeah. And the thing about slippery slope arguments is that, some of them are fallacious, as you mentioned, but others are legitimate. And whether a slippery slope argument is legitimate or not depends on whether or not you have warrant for the slippery slope. And I think in the case of life issues, we do. For example, we can say, well, legalization of abortion will lead to the legalization of infanticide. And while a pro-choice person might just wave that away as a fallacious slippery slope argument, well, we can show, well, okay, number one, we have philosophers who are actually arguing for the moral permissibility of infanticide and arguing that it should be a legal choice. Number two, we have politicians who are arguing against the protection of children born by botched abortions, that they argue against doctors having an obligation then to protect that child. And so we have now politicians arguing for infanticide in the case of a botched abortion. So it seems like it absolutely is a slippery slope. And we even have legalized cases like Baby Doe from the 80s, a child born with Down syndrome who had a correctable illness, but that ailment was made it so that he couldn't swallow food, and so he was going to starve to death. And so that was an easily correctable thing, but the courts allowed them to allowed the parents to let the children starve to death over the protestations of the doctors because the child had Down syndrome. So all of these things are slippery slopes, and they do lead to a devaluation of life. And so when we talk about the euthanasia issue, well, the thing about euthanasia is that if you start legalizing euthanasia in certain cases, you start kind of the gears turning and saying, well, these things that we euthanize people for, they are things that make life not worth living. And so now we've suddenly put people in the place of God and saying, and not just, if you want to go the non-religious route too, we're basically saying that people who are able-bodied are now saying that because I wouldn't want to live a life with a certain kind of disability, that we should be allowing those people to die, or in certain cases, especially with abortion, that we should just be killing them outright because it's not a life that's worth living, which, of course, is kind of scary because it has Nazian overtones, life unworthy of life. Suddenly, if you're allowing doctors to say there are certain types of life that makes life not worth living, well, suddenly now you're basically giving them the freedom now, not just to kill anyone who comes to them, but now there's also the idea that, well, killing that person now is actually a benefit to the person. So it's actually doing the person a favor to end their life because it's not something that we would want to live with. And so, and not only that, but now we need, we have this problem. We need to free up hospital beds and things like that. And so now suddenly the culture is shifting in such a way as to say that, yeah, there are certain people which we should be euthanizing against their will, basically. And we have seen that in certain countries that have euthanasia legal, that legalized euthanasia often leads to that voluntary euthanasia often leads to involuntary euthanasia. So it's something that we definitely need to be very, very careful about. And that's one of the things that pro-life people are arguing is one of the reasons that we should not be legalizing euthanasia, because of this very reasonable slippery slope.
Okay, well, thank you for all that. We have just barely scratched the surface on these issues. As you said, probably the most important thing that we could do is to educate ourselves. If there's someone listening to this that says, wow, I need to get educated on these things, where do they need to go?
Well, as far as education, you can go to the various pro-life groups. You have Life Training Institute, Equal Rights Institute, Justice for All, Center for Bioethical Reform, Students for Life of America. All these organizations, they're mainly geared toward abortion. So if you want to educate yourself on abortion, those are the places to go. As far as just bioethics in general, you can go to the National Review, which is a conservative publication. You can go to, you can check out the work of Wesley J. Smith. He has a blog which he calls Human Exceptionalism, in which he talks about bioethics in general. Sorry about the dogs barking in the background here. But yeah, you can go to those various places, or you can, there are various books that you can find on the issue. One that I'm currently going through is the second edition of Embryo, A Defense of Human Life by Robert P. George and Christopher Tollefson, which has implications for abortion, but is not specifically about the abortion issue. It's actually about the stem cell research issue. So yeah, there are various places you can go, or if someone wants some specific books they can read or information, you can also just send me an email. My email is clinton@prolifetraining.com, and I can recommend some further resources or just answer questions for anyone out there as well.
Okay. And one last chance to plug your ministry, where people could go to find out more about you or your work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I said, you can email me, clinton@prolifetraining.com, or you can go to www.prolifetraining.com, which is the Life Training Institute website, and you can go to their blog, and you can find several of the blogs that I've written, the blog articles I've written, as well as going to Secular Pro-Life. Like I said, I have articles there as well. You can also find me on Facebook. You can add me there, and those are the main places. I'm also on Twitter as well, but I don't really check or interact on Twitter very often, just because of the really reduced character limits. And most of my interactions are on Facebook.
Okay. Well, I could just go on and on about this for hours. However, other things in life call. Thank you for your time and your input.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Appreciate the opportunity.
All right, man. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Pour out your love, oh God. Send it down like rain. Pour out your grace and then let us all praise your name.